Before there were pyramids, there were mastabas. The mastabas are older, stranger, and in many ways more revealing than the monuments that replaced them. But almost no one outside of Egyptology has ever heard of them. The word itself, mastaba, is Arabic for bench, a name given by local workers centuries ago because the low, flat-topped, rectangular structures rising from the desert sand looked like the mud brick benches outside their houses. The ancient Egyptians had a different name for them. They called them perdejet, house for eternity. And for more than 500 years, these houses for eternity were the most sacred structures in the Nile Valley. Every pharaoh of the earliest dynasties was buried in one. Every queen, every prince, every vizier and high priest. The mastaba was not a stepping stone to the pyramid. It was the original vision of eternity, the first monumental answer to the question that every civilization must eventually confront. What do we build to outlast death? And here is what makes that question so unsettling. The earliest mastabas at Saqqara and Abydos, the ones built for the very first pharaohs of a united Egypt, more than 5,000 years ago by current scholarly estimates, were not simple structures. They were enormous. Mastaba S 3504, built during the reign of Pharaoh Jet in the First Dynasty, measures over 56 meters long and more than 25 meters wide. It was made of thousands of sun-dried mud bricks, arranged with a precision that implies organized labor on an industrial scale, and surrounding it, arranged in neat rows, were dozens of subsidiary graves. Graves that contained the bodies of young men and women who may have been killed at the time of the pharaoh's funeral and buried alongside him, sacrificed, so that the king would not enter eternity alone. That detail, the retainer burials, the subsidiary graves, the possibility of human sacrifice at the dawn of Egyptian civilization, is one that most accounts of the pyramids prefer to skip over entirely. The pyramids are clean, they are geometric, they are beautiful. But the mastabas that came before them are raw. They are heavy with the smell of mud brick and the weight of blood. They are the roots of a tradition that would eventually produce the Great Pyramid of Giza. But those roots run through dark soil. And it gets stranger. For more than a century, archaeologists have argued about whether the earliest pharaohs were buried at Abydos, in the south, or at Saqqara, in the north, because both sites contain massive mastabas from the same reigns. The Abydos tombs are modest in size but rich in grave goods. The Saqqara mastabas are vast, elaborately decorated with what is called the palace facade pattern, niched brickwork that imitates the wooden panelling of a royal palace. Were the Saqqara mastabas the real royal tombs and the Abydos ones mere cenotaphs? Or was it the other way around? Walter Bryan Emery, the British archaeologist, who spent decades excavating the great Saqqara mastabas, believed they were royal tombs. Other scholars disagreed. The debate has never been fully resolved, and it means that for the very first dynasty of a united Egypt, the dynasty that invented the idea of pharaonic burial, we are not entirely certain where the kings were actually buried. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand how a simple rectangular tomb made of mud brick became the ancestor of the most famous monuments on Earth, how the mastaba evolved over 5 centuries into something no one had ever imagined before, and why the things buried inside the earliest mastabas tell us more about the birth of Egyptian civilization than the pyramids ever could. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin, and the things we find inside them are extraordinary. In the First Dynasty mastabas at Saqqara, Emery's teams uncovered ivory labels with some of the earliest known examples of Egyptian writing, pictographic script scratched into small bone tags that were once attached to jars of oil, bundles of linen and containers of food. These labels are not grand inscriptions. They are inventory lists, receipts, shipping manifests for the afterlife, and they tell us that the concept of writing in Egypt may not have begun with literature or theology or royal proclamation. It may have begun with accounting, with the urgent, practical need to label the grave goods of a dead king, so that the priests would know which jar contained beer and which contained wine, which chest held sandals and which held cosmetics. Writing, in its earliest Egyptian form, was a technology of death. It was invented not to record the thoughts of the living, but to organize the provisions of the dead. That revelation, that the roots of one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements may lie in the mundane logistics of burial, is the kind of discovery the mastabas deliver again and again. They are not elegant, they are not photogenic, they do not catch the light the way a pyramid does at sunset, but they are the foundation. They are where everything began. And the story they tell of a civilization learning, generation by generation, how to build a house that could outlast time is one of the most extraordinary narratives in human history. It is also one of the least known. The pyramids get the documentaries. The mastabas get a paragraph in the textbook. That imbalance ends tonight. To understand the mastaba, begin at the beginning, not with the first dynasty, but with the centuries before it, when Egypt was not yet a unified kingdom and the dead were buried in the simplest way imaginable. A body placed in a shallow oval pit in the desert sand, curled on its side in what archaeologists call the foetal position, facing west toward the setting sun. No coffin, no wrapping, no monument above, just the body and the sand. And the sand, as it happens, was an extraordinary preservative. The dry heat of the Egyptian desert desiccated the body naturally, drawing out moisture before bacteria could decompose the flesh. Some of the oldest preserved human remains in Egypt are these pre-dynastic pit burials, bodies that have survived for more than 5,000 years with skin, hair, and fingernails still intact. Not because of embalming, because of sand. This is where the story of the mastaba, and by extension, the story of the entire Egyptian funerary tradition, takes its first unexpected turn. The natural mummification produced by simple desert burial was so effective that the earliest Egyptians could see their dead preserved. They could see that the body endured. And from that observation, a belief crystallized that would shape Egyptian civilization for the next 3 millennia. The belief that the preservation of the body was essential for the survival of the soul. The ka, the spiritual double, needed an intact body to return to. The ba, the personality, needed a physical home. If the body was destroyed, the afterlife was lost. But there was a problem. As Egyptian society grew more complex and more hierarchical, as villages became towns and towns became the two competing kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, the elite began to want more for their dead than a simple pit in the sand. They wanted to mark the graves. They wanted to surround the body with offerings, food, tools, weapons, jewelry. They wanted to build a structure above the burial that would signal the status of the person below. And when they built that structure, when they covered the pit with a rectangular mound of sand or rubble, and then encased it in mud brick, they created something new. They created a barrier between the body and the preserving sand. The very act of building a tomb began to interfere with the natural process that had preserved the dead for centuries. The solution to that interference, artificial mummification, the deliberate desiccation and wrapping of the body, would take centuries to develop. But the problem was created by the mastaba. The monument designed to honor the dead was, paradoxically, the thing that made the dead harder to preserve. The earliest true mastabas appeared during the period scholars call the early dynastic, around 3100 BC according to current estimates. The era when, for the first time, Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under a single ruler. The site most associated with these earliest mastabas is Abydos in Upper Egypt, where the first pharaohs of the newly united kingdom were buried in a desert cemetery called el-Kab, Mother of Pots, named for the millions of pottery sherds that litter the surface, the remains of offerings left over thousands of years. The man who first excavated these tombs in a systematic way was Flinders Petrie, one of the founding figures of modern archaeology, and a man whose methods, while imperfect by today's standards, were revolutionary for the 1890s. Petrie arrived at Abydos in 1899, following in the wake of the French archaeologist Émile Amelunot, whose earlier excavations had been so careless that the Petrie was reportedly horrified by the damage. Amelunot had dug for treasure, not for knowledge. He had thrown away pottery, ignored stratigraphy, and failed to record the precise locations of his finds. Petrie came to salvage what remained. What he found was extraordinary. Beneath the surface of el-Kab, Petrie uncovered a row of tombs belonging to the kings of the First Dynasty. Horaha, Jer, Jet-Den, Anejib, Semerket, and Ka. These were not grand structures by later standards. They were rectangular pits cut into the desert gravel, lined with mud brick walls, and covered with flat roofs of timber and matting. The burial chambers were relatively small. The largest, belonging to King Jer, measured roughly 13 by 12 meters. But what surrounded these chambers was staggering. King Jer's tomb was ringed by 318 subsidiary graves. 318, arranged in neat rows around the royal burial chamber, each one containing a body. Some of the bodies were accompanied by small stelae, simple stone markers bearing the name and title of the deceased. Others were anonymous. All were young. Many showed signs of having been killed, strangled, possibly, or poisoned. The evidence, while debated, points toward a practice that would be abandoned within a few generations, but that haunts the First Dynasty like a shadow. Retainer sacrifice. The deliberate killing of servants, officials, and possibly even family members, so that the king would be attended in the afterlife by the same people who had served him in life. The numbers are striking. Horaha, the first king of the First Dynasty, had 36 subsidiary burials at his tomb, and 6 more at his funerary enclosure. His successor, Jer, had 318 at the tomb, and 269 at the enclosure. That is nearly 600 people who may have died, or been killed, to accompany a single king into eternity. By the reign of Ka, the last king of the First Dynasty, the practice had diminished significantly. By the Second Dynasty, it had essentially ceased. Egypt discovered, within the span of roughly 2 centuries, that there were better ways to provision the afterlife than killing the living. But the subsidiary burials at Abydos are not just evidence of sacrifice. They are evidence of organization. 318 graves do not arrange themselves in neat rows. They require planning, coordination, construction. They require a bureaucracy, a system of labor management, material procurement, and architectural oversight that was already operating at a sophisticated level before the first stone pyramid was ever conceived. The mastaba was not just a tomb, it was a project, and the projects grew larger with each generation. While Petrie was working at Abydos, another story was unfolding at Saqqara, the great necropolis on the west bank of the Nile, overlooking the ancient capital of Memphis. Here, on the edge of the desert escarpment, a different kind of mastaba had been discovered. These were not the modest pit tombs of Abydos. These were enormous, some measuring more than 50 meters in length and 25 meters in width, built of thousands of mud bricks, their exterior walls decorated with an elaborate pattern of niches and recesses that scholars call the palace facade. This pattern, which mimics the appearance of a wooden panelled palace, was not decorative in the ordinary sense. It was magical. The mastaba was meant to serve as the deceased's eternal palace, a house in which the dead king would dwell forever, furnished with everything he had enjoyed in life. Walter Bryan Emery spent decades excavating these great Saqqara mastabas, beginning in the 1930s and continuing into the 1950s. He uncovered 6 massive First Dynasty mastabas, tombs so large and so elaborately constructed that he became convinced they were the true royal tombs of the First Dynasty, not the smaller structures at Abydos. Emery published his findings in a monumental 3-volume work, Great Tombs of the First Dynasty, which remains one of the foundational texts of early dynastic archaeology. Inside these mastabas, Emery found evidence of a civilization that was already remarkably sophisticated. Hundreds of stone vessels, bowls, jars and plates carved from hard stones like schist, diorite and alabaster were stored in the magazines that surrounded the central burial chamber. These vessels were not crude. They were finished with a precision that implies the use of advanced stoneworking technology, possibly including the lathe. Some were so thin-walled that they were translucent. They represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor each, and there were hundreds of them in a single tomb. Emery also found ivory labels, small rectangular tags, each perforated for attachment to a container, bearing pictographic inscriptions that recorded the contents, the date of production, and sometimes the name of a royal estate. These labels are among the earliest examples of writing in Egypt, and their content is revealing. They tell us about oil production, linen manufacture, and the organization of royal workshops. They tell us that the First Dynasty state was already managing a complex economy with standardized systems of measurement and record keeping. And they tell us all of this because someone thought it was important to bring these records into the tomb to ensure that the dead king would know what he had and how to use it. But here's the problem. If the great Saqqara mastabas were the royal tombs, then what were the Abydos structures? Cenotaphs, symbolic tombs with no body inside? Or was it the other way around? Were the Abydos tombs the real burials, and the Saqqara mastabas the tombs of powerful nobles who served the king? The debate has swung back and forth for more than a century. Emery was firmly in the Saqqara camp. More recent scholarship, led by archaeologists like Gunter Dreyer and the German Archaeological Institute, has tended to favour Abydos as the site of the actual royal burials, based in part on the discovery of additional funerary enclosures, and on the fact that the Abydos tombs sit within a sacred landscape that was continuously revered for millennia. Even the Osiris cult of later periods claimed this cemetery as the burial place of the gods themselves. The resolution of this debate may never come, but the debate itself reveals something important about the mastaba as a form. It was not a single thing. It was a flexible, evolving architectural type that could serve different purposes in different places. At Abydos, the mastaba was the king's burial chamber, modest in scale, embedded in sacred ground surrounded by sacrifice. At Saqqara, the mastaba was the king's palace of the dead, vast, architecturally ambitious, filled with the material wealth of the early state. The two sites were not in competition. They were in conversation, two expressions of the same impulse, refined over generations. And that impulse was accelerating. The mastabas of the Second Dynasty, the dynasty that followed Horaha and Jer and Jet, show clear advances in construction technique. The burial chambers sank deeper underground. Superstructures grew more elaborate. Stairways were added, allowing access to the underground chambers without dismantling the roof. And stone began to appear, not as the primary building material, not yet, but as reinforcement, as lining, as a sign of things to come. The crucial figure in this transition is a man whose name was not even known to modern scholarship until the 1920s, when it was found inscribed on the base of a statue at Saqqara. His name was Imhotep, and what he did with the mastaba changed the world. Imhotep was the vizier of King Djoser, the second pharaoh of the Third Dynasty, who ruled around 2667 to 2648 BC by current estimates. Djoser inherited a tradition of mastaba building that had been refined over 5 centuries. His predecessors had built in mud brick. Some had incorporated stone elements, but no one had built an entire royal monument in stone. No one had attempted to translate the flat, horizontal form of the mastaba into something vertical. No one had stacked one mastaba on top of another and created, in the process, a shape that had never existed before, until Imhotep did. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the world's first pyramid, began as a mastaba. Excavations have shown that the original plan was for a conventional square mastaba, approximately 63 meters on each side, built not of mud brick, but of small limestone blocks. This was already revolutionary. No structure of this size had ever been built entirely in stone. But Imhotep did not stop there. At some point during construction, and the reasons remain unclear, he expanded the mastaba, then placed a second, smaller mastaba on top of it, then a third, then a fourth. Eventually, the structure reached 6 tiers, rising to a height of roughly 62 meters. It was the tallest man-made structure on Earth at the time of its completion, and it was, unmistakably, a stack of mastabas. The form that had been flat and horizontal for 500 years had been turned vertical. The bench had become a stairway. The house for eternity had become a stairway to the sky. The theological implications were profound. The mastaba had served as a palace for the dead, a place where the Ka could dwell, receive offerings, and exist in perpetuity. The step pyramid transformed that metaphor. The dead king was no longer simply resting in his eternal house. He was ascending. The steps were a literal stairway to the heavens, a means by which the pharaoh could climb to join the sun god Ra in his daily journey across the sky. The shift from horizontal to vertical was not just architectural, it was cosmological, and the complex that surrounded the step pyramid was equally revolutionary. Imhotep did not simply build a bigger tomb. He built an entire ceremonial city, a walled compound covering roughly 15 hectares, containing temples, courtyards, chapels, and what appears to be a full-scale recreation of the structures used in the Hebsed festival, the royal jubilee ceremony that renewed the pharaoh's power. These structures were rendered in stone, columns shaped like papyrus bundles, doors that appeared to be open but were carved from solid limestone, buildings that looked functional but were solid throughout. They were, in effect, three-dimensional architectural drawings, not buildings for the living, buildings for the dead. Permanent stone versions of the temporary wooden structures that the living king had used during his real ceremonies. Previous to Djoser's complex, the king's tomb and the ritual enclosures had been physically separated. At Abydos, the funerary enclosures sat more than a kilometre from the royal tombs at el-Kab. Imhotep unified everything into a single compound, the tomb and the temple, the burial and the ritual, all within one wall. This unification would define Egyptian royal funerary architecture for the next 2,000 years. Every pyramid complex that followed, from the pyramids of Giza to the pyramid temples of the 5th and 6th dynasties, followed the template that Imhotep established at Saqqara, and it all came from the mastaba. The step pyramid is not a rejection of the mastaba form. It is its culmination, its logical endpoint, pushed to an extreme by one extraordinary mind. Imhotep took the idea of the house for eternity and made it touch the sky. He took the flat bench and made it climb, and in doing so, he created the ancestor of every pyramid that would follow, while simultaneously ending the era in which the mastaba served as the primary form of royal burial. But here is what most accounts of the step pyramid miss. The mastaba did not die when the pyramid was born. Far from it. The pyramid replaced the mastaba as the tomb of the king. But the mastaba continued to be built, prolifically, magnificently, for centuries, as the tomb of the elite. Every vizier, every governor, every high priest, every important noble of the Old Kingdom was buried in a mastaba. And the mastabas of the Old Kingdom, the ones built during the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, the great age of pyramid building, are among the most beautifully decorated and archaeologically informative structures ever discovered in Egypt. The pyramids tell us about kings. The mastabas tell us about everyone else. The pyramids are almost devoid of interior decoration. Blank walls, bare corridors, empty chambers. The mastabas are alive with colour, painted reliefs covering every wall, depicting scenes of farming, fishing, hunting, feasting, dancing, metalworking, boat building, bread baking, beer brewing, and the daily activities of a civilization at its peak. If you want to know what life was like in ancient Egypt during the Pyramid Age, you do not study the pyramids, you study the mastabas. And the story the mastabas tell is one that the pyramids, for all their grandeur, cannot match. The shift from royal tomb to elite tomb did not diminish the mastaba, it liberated it. Freed from the constraints of royal funerary theology, which demanded specific orientations, specific chamber layouts, specific ritual sequences, the mastaba became a canvas. Tomb owners competed with each other for the most elaborate decorations, the largest number of rooms, the most vivid scenes of daily life, and the results were extraordinary. At Saqqara alone, hundreds of mastabas from the Old Kingdom have been documented. Many more remain unexcavated. The necropolis extends for kilometers along the edge of the desert escarpment, a city of the dead that mirrors, in its extent and its social hierarchy, the living city of Memphis that once lay below. The richest mastabas are clustered near the royal pyramids. Proximity to the king was as important in death as it was in life. The less wealthy tombs spread outward in decreasing size and elaboration. It is a map of social status, rendered in stone and mud brick, stretching across the desert for 3 millennia. And this is where the modern discovery story begins. The story of how the mastabas of the Old Kingdom went from buried ruins to some of the most important archaeological sites in the world. That story starts with a Frenchman named Auguste Mariette, who would become the founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service and one of the most consequential figures in the history of Egyptology. In 1850, Mariette was in Egypt on a completely different errand. He had been sent by the Louvre to collect Coptic manuscripts from Egyptian monasteries. But Mariette was an archaeologist at heart, and when he visited Saqqara and saw the head of a sphinx protruding from the sand, He abandoned his manuscript hunt entirely. He began digging. What he found was the Serapeum, the underground burial place of the sacred Apis bulls, one of the most dramatic archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. But Mariette's work at Saqqara did not end with the bulls. He continued to excavate across the necropolis, and in 1865, he discovered the mastaba of Ti. Ti was not a pharaoh. He was not even of royal blood. He was a senior official of the 5th dynasty, a man who held the titles Overseer of the Pyramids of Nusere, Overseer of the Sun Temples of Sahua, Neferika, and Nusere, and controller of the farms and stock of the royal family. He was, in modern terms, a senior civil servant, a man who managed the logistical apparatus of the state, and his tomb, buried under meters of sand in the Saqqara necropolis, contained some of the most beautiful and informative painted reliefs ever found in ancient Egypt. Mariette's discovery of the mastaba of Ti was a landmark moment. The tomb had been sealed for more than 4,000 years. The sand that had buried it had protected the reliefs from rain, wind, and the destructive effects of human touch. When the sand was cleared, the walls emerged in astonishing condition. Crisp, detailed, vibrantly coloured scenes of life along the Nile. Here was Ti, standing on a papyrus boat, overseeing a hippopotamus hunt in the marshes. Here were farmers ploughing fields with wooden ploughs pulled by oxen. Here were fishermen hauling nets. Here were bakers kneading dough and brewers straining beer through cloth sieves. Here were carpenters building boats, their tools rendered in precise detail. Adzes, chisels, saws, mallets. Here were butchers slaughtering cattle, their postures anatomically accurate. Here were dancers and musicians, weavers and potters, scribes and overseers. The mastaba of Ti was not a tomb. It was a documentary, a 5,000-year-old film, frame by frame, of a civilization at work, and it had been hiding beneath the sand of Saqqara, waiting for someone to look. But Ti's mastaba was not unique. It was one of hundreds. The Saqqara necropolis contains mastabas from every period of the Old Kingdom, representing every level of the social hierarchy. And the decorated ones, the ones with painted reliefs on their walls, provide a collective portrait of Egyptian life that has no parallel in the ancient world. No other civilization left such a detailed visual record of its daily existence. The Mesopotamians had cuneiform tablets, the Greeks had literature, the Romans had mosaics, but the Egyptians had their tomb walls, and the mastabas are where those walls speak most clearly. The reliefs were not mere decoration. They were functional. In Egyptian theology, images had magical power. A scene of a farmer harvesting grain, painted on a tomb wall, would magically provide grain for the deceased in the afterlife. A scene of a butcher slaughtering a bull would magically provide meat. A scene of a brewery would magically provide beer. The tomb walls were in effect a magical supply chain, an eternal food delivery service rendered in paint. If the real offerings stopped, if the priests forgot, if the endowments ran out, the painted scenes would continue to feed the dead. The mastaba was not just a house for the body, it was a warehouse for the soul. And this is why the mastabas are so extraordinarily informative. Because the tomb owners wanted their magical supply chains to be complete, they depicted everything. Every stage of food production, every craft, every trade, every seasonal activity. The result is an encyclopedia of Egyptian life, painted on limestone walls, preserved by the dry desert air, and available to anyone who digs carefully enough. The mastabas have told us more about ancient Egyptian agriculture, industry, social structure, and daily existence than any other source. More than the temples, more than the papyri, more than the pyramids. And the story of their discovery and documentation is a story that continues to this day. As recently as January of 2025, a joint French-Swiss archaeological mission announced the discovery of a previously unknown Old Kingdom mastaba at Saqqara, its walls still bearing carved and painted inscriptions in excellent condition. The sand of Saqqara has not finished giving up its dead, and each new mastaba that emerges adds another chapter to the longest-running documentary in human history. And yet, for all their richness, the mastabas of the Old Kingdom represent only the second chapter of the story. The first chapter, the one that deals with the earliest mastabas, the ones built before the pyramids, the ones that contained not painted reliefs but blood, is the one that poses the deepest questions. because those earliest mastabas were not just tombs for the dead. They were instruments of power for the living. They were the means by which the first pharaohs demonstrated their authority over life and death. And the transformation of the mastaba from a mud brick tomb surrounded by sacrificed retainers into a limestone chapel filled with scenes of daily joy is one of the most remarkable moral evolutions in the history of human civilization. The mastabas went from death machines to art galleries, from places of sacrifice to places of beauty, from expressions of tyrannical power to expressions of individual life. That transformation took 500 years, and it happened not because someone decreed it, but because the form itself evolved, because each generation of builders, each generation of tomb owners, found new ways to use the rectangular walls and the flat roofs and the underground chambers. The mastaba was flexible enough to absorb every change in Egyptian society, from the violence of the early dynastic to the sophistication of the Old Kingdom, and still remain recognizably itself, a house for eternity, a bench made of stone, a purjet. But the deepest mystery of the mastaba is not what it contains, it is what it became. And to understand that transformation, the moment when the bench became a stairway, when the house became a mountain, when the purjet reached for the sky, we must look more closely at the archaeology itself, at the specific mastabas, at the specific men and women who were buried in them, and at the specific discoveries that revealed, century by century, what the mastaba truly was. The central paradox of the mastaba is this: it is the most important architectural form in the history of ancient Egypt, and it is also the most neglected. The pyramids have been studied, measured, scanned, theorized about, and fought over for centuries. The mastabas, the form that preceded them, the form that made them possible, the form that continued alongside them for the entire duration of pharaonic civilization, have received a fraction of that attention. And the reason is simple. Pyramids are dramatic, mastabas are not. Pyramids are tall, mastabas are flat. Pyramids are photogenic. Mastabas look like low rectangles of eroded stone, indistinguishable from the surrounding desert to the untrained eye. The shape that revolutionized human architecture is, from the outside, one of the least visually compelling shapes ever built. But here's the problem. The relative neglect of the mastaba has left enormous gaps in our understanding of the most critical period in Egyptian history. The period between roughly 3100 and 2600 BC, when Egypt was transformed from a collection of competing chiefdoms into the most powerful and most organized state in the ancient world. This is the period of the first pharaohs, the first writing, the first centralized government, the first monumental architecture. Everything that came later, the pyramids, the temples, the empire, was built on foundations laid during these 5 centuries. And the primary archaeological evidence for those 5 centuries is the mastaba. Consider the scale of what we do not know. The first dynasty of Egypt lasted roughly 200 years. During that time, at least 8 kings ruled over a newly united kingdom stretching from the Mediterranean to the first cataract of the Nile. These kings built mastabas at Abydos and possibly at Saqqara. They established funerary cults, commissioned grave goods, and organized the construction of massive mud brick monuments. They may have practiced retainer sacrifice. They certainly developed systems of writing, administration, and trade that would underpin the Egyptian state for millennia. And yet, for most of these kings, we know almost nothing beyond their names. And in some cases, we are not even certain of those. King Horha, the first ruler of the first dynasty, is known from his tomb at Abydos, from the enormous mastaba at Saqqara that may or may not have been his, and from a handful of inscribed objects, ivory labels, pottery fragments, seal impressions. His reign lasted perhaps 30 years. 30 years of governing a kingdom that stretched more than 1,000 kilometers along the Nile. And the total written record of that reign fits on a tabletop. We know he existed, we know he built, we know he was buried with attendants who may have been killed to serve him. Beyond that, the record falls silent. King Jer, his successor, is slightly better known, but only because his tomb at Abydos was the largest and most elaborately furnished of the first dynasty royal tombs, and because the subsidiary burials surrounding it are the most numerous. 318 graves. Among the objects found in the tomb was a mummified arm adorned with 4 bracelets of gold, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and amethyst. Petrie found the arm during his excavation and brought it to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The museum's curator at the time, according to the account that has passed into Egyptological legend, removed the bracelets and discarded the arm. The arm, the actual physical remains of either the king or one of his queens, was thrown away. The bracelets were kept. The objects mattered more than the body. That anecdote, whether fully accurate or partly apocryphal, captures something essential about the early archaeology of the mastabas. The focus was on objects, on treasure, on portable antiquities, on things that could be removed, displayed, and admired. The structures themselves were secondary. The mud brick walls, the architectural layouts, the spatial relationships between tombs, these were documented, sometimes carefully and sometimes not, but they were rarely treated as the primary source of information. And yet, as later archaeologists would discover, the architecture of the mastabas is often more informative than the objects inside them. The palace facade mastabas at Saqqara are a perfect example. These great mud brick structures, Emery's great tombs of the First Dynasty, are distinguished by their exterior decoration. The niched brickwork, with its pattern of alternating projections and recesses, does not simply look like a palace. It is a palace, rendered in mud brick and scaled to eternity. The niches are not structural, they are representational. They mimic the wooden framework of a real building, the pillars and panels of a royal residence, translated into a permanent medium, and the quality of the brickwork is remarkable. The bricks are uniform in size, precisely laid, and finished with a smooth plaster coating. These are not crude constructions, they are engineered. Emery, excavating these mastabas in the 1930s and 40s, was struck by their sophistication. He wrote that the palace facade decoration could only have been produced by craftsmen working under close supervision to a definite plan. That observation is more significant than it might appear. Close supervision, a definite plan. These phrases imply a construction management system, architects, supervisors, quality control, that was already operating at a high level more than 5,000 years ago. The logistics of building a mastaba like S3503, 42 meters long, 16 meters wide, with 23 internal chambers and 20 subsidiary tombs, were not trivial. They required the coordinated labor of hundreds of workers over months or years. And this was before the pyramids, before Imhotep, before anyone had conceived of building in stone. And it gets worse. The internal complexity of the early mastabas has never been fully explained. Why did the First Dynasty tomb builders create so many chambers? The central room held the sarcophagus. That part is clear. But the surrounding rooms, filled with grave goods, present a puzzle. Were they meant to replicate the rooms of a palace? Were they meant to serve different functions in the afterlife? A bedroom, a kitchen, a storeroom, a throne room. Were they organized according to a plan that we can no longer reconstruct because the organizational logic died with the people who created it? Emery catalogued the contents of each chamber with typical thoroughness. In one tomb, he found a room filled entirely with stone vessels, hundreds of them, made from schist, diorite, alabaster, and breccia in a bewildering variety of shapes. In another room he found stacked jars of grain, in another rolls of linen, in another tools, copper adzes, chisels and saw blades, in another gaming pieces, circular discs and pegged boards for a game whose rules are lost. Each room was a category. Each category was a necessity. The mastaba was not a random collection of objects. It was a curated inventory of everything the dead would need, organized, labeled, and sealed for eternity. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. Almost every mastaba that has ever been excavated, from the First Dynasty to the Old Kingdom, from Saqqara to Giza to Abydos, has been robbed. Every single one. The grave goods that Emery found were the remnants, the things that the robbers had left behind because they were too heavy, too bulky, or too difficult to remove in haste. The gold was gone, the jewelry was gone, the precious metals, the portable valuables, the objects that could be carried and sold, all gone. The stone vessels survived because no one wanted to carry a 2-kilogram schist bowl through a narrow tunnel in the dark. The grain survived because it had no resale value. The copper tools survived because they had corroded into green lumps. What we know about the mastabas, in other words, is based on what the robbers did not take. Our understanding of the earliest centuries of Egyptian civilization is built on the leftovers, the rejects, the objects too worthless to steal. The portrait of the first dynasty that emerges from the archaeological record is, by definition, incomplete. We see the bones, but not the flesh. We see the vessels, but not the gold. We see the subsidiary graves, but not the faces of the people buried in them. The robbers came early, and they came often. Many of the Abydos tombs show signs of having been entered within decades of their construction, possibly within the lifetimes of the people who had built them. The Saqqara mastabas were similarly violated. Emery found evidence of tunneling in almost every tomb he excavated. Narrow passages cut through the mud brick walls by robbers who knew exactly where to dig. This was not opportunistic looting. It was informed, systematic theft, carried out by people who understood the layout of the tombs and knew where the most valuable objects would be stored. This knowledge is itself significant. Who knew the layout of a royal mastaba? The builders, the architects, the priests who conducted the funeral rites, the workers who sealed the chambers. The subsidiary burials suggest that some of these people were killed and buried alongside the king, perhaps precisely to prevent them from revealing the tomb's secrets. But the robbing suggests that the secret did not hold. Someone talked, someone drew a map, someone led the robbers through the dark. And this pattern, build, seal, rob, repeated across every dynasty. The mastabas of the Old Kingdom were robbed as systematically as the mastabas of the First Dynasty. The royal pyramids were robbed. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings were robbed. The only tomb in the history of Egyptian archaeology that was found essentially intact, Tutankhamun's in 1922, was the exception that proved the rule. Every other royal or elite burial has been violated. The mastaba builders knew this would happen. They tried to prevent it. They dug deeper shafts, built thicker walls, added portcullises and blocking stones. None of it worked. The robbers always found a way in. And this is where the mastaba delivers its harshest lesson. The Purjet, the house for eternity, was not eternal. It was not even secure for a century. The entire funerary program of ancient Egypt, the massive investment of labor, materials, and theological imagination that went into building the mastabas, furnishing them, and staffing them with priests, was fundamentally vulnerable to the simplest and most human of motivations: greed. A gold bracelet on a dead queen's arm was worth more to a living thief than the queen's eternal afterlife. The sacred was subordinate to the economic, and the mastaba, for all its massive walls and sealed chambers, could not protect the dead from the living. This vulnerability haunts the entire history of the mastaba. Every innovation in tomb design, from the simple pit to the lined chamber, from the mud brick superstructure to the stone-cased mastaba, from the underground shaft to the labyrinthine corridor, can be read as a response to robbery. The architects were not just building tombs, they were building fortifications, and the fortifications always failed. The step pyramid was, among other things, the most radical anti-robbery measure ever conceived. By placing the burial chamber beneath 62 meters of stone, Imhotep made the grave goods harder to reach than any mastaba had ever done. The true pyramids that followed, with their hidden entrances, their false corridors, their granite plugs and relieving chambers, were even more elaborate defensive systems. But they too were defeated. The pyramids of Giza were robbed in antiquity. The pyramids of Dashur were robbed. Even the step pyramid itself was violated. The arms race between builders and robbers lasted 3,000 years, and the robbers won every round. But the mastabas of the Old Kingdom, the non-royal tombs, the ones built for viziers and officials and priests, offer a different kind of survival. Their grave goods are gone. Their mummies are destroyed. Their gold has been melted down for centuries. But their walls remain, and on those walls the painted reliefs have survived in a way that the portable grave goods could not. A robber can steal a bracelet. A robber cannot steal a wall. The very thing that makes the mastaba architecturally dull, its massive, flat, stone construction, is the thing that preserved its most valuable contents. The reliefs could not be removed. The paintings could not be carried. They were embedded in the structure itself, inseparable from the stone that held them. And because they were inseparable, they survived. This is the ultimate irony of the mastaba. The objects that were meant to sustain the dead, the gold, the jewelry, the food, the furniture, are gone. The images that were meant to supplement those objects, the magical scenes on the walls, remain. The backup system outlasted the primary system. The insurance policy outlasted the investment. And it is the insurance policy, the painted walls, the carved reliefs, the magical scenes of farming and fishing and feasting that has proven most valuable to us, not as magic, as history, as the most complete visual record of daily life that any ancient civilization has left behind. Something is wrong with our assumptions about what mattered in these tombs. We have spent centuries searching for gold. We should have been reading the walls. The mastaba of Hezi-Ray, a 3rd dynasty official who served under King Joza, illustrates this perfectly. His tomb, discovered at Saqqara, is one of the earliest to feature a new innovation that would define the mastaba for the rest of the Old Kingdom, the false door. This was a stone panel carved to look like a doorway, set into the western wall of the offering chapel. The false door did not lead anywhere. It was not an entrance. It was a portal, a magical threshold through which the deceased's car could emerge from the burial chamber below to receive the food offerings placed on the altar in front of it. The car would pass through the false door, consume the spiritual essence of the offerings, and return to the burial chamber refreshed and sustained. The false door was the mastaba's beating heart. Every mastaba of the Old Kingdom had one, or sometimes several, one for the tomb owner, one for his wife, one for each member of the family buried in the structure. The design evolved over centuries, from simple niched panels to elaborate carved doorways with multiple frames, inscribed with the names and titles of the deceased and surrounded by scenes of offering. But the function remained constant. It was the meeting point between the living and the dead, the place where the boundary between this world and the next was thinnest, and the mastaba of Hezi-Ray contained something else, a set of wooden panels, carved with the image of the tomb owner in stunning detail that represent some of the finest examples of Egyptian relief carving ever found. These panels, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, show Hezi-Ray standing and seated, holding the tools of his trade, scribal palettes, reed pens, and wearing the elaborate wig and collar of a high official. The carving is shallow but extraordinarily precise. Every muscle, every fold of cloth, every individual bead on the collar is rendered with a clarity that suggests the carver was working from close observation of the living man. These panels are more than 4,600 years old, and they are more lifelike, more anatomically precise, more artistically accomplished than anything produced in Europe for the next 3,000 years. The decorated mastaba, in other words, was not a primitive form. It was a medium of extraordinary artistic sophistication, and the art it produced, the painted reliefs, the carved panels, the limestone statues hidden in sealed chambers called serdabs, represents the highest achievement of Old Kingdom visual culture, not the pyramids. The pyramids are engineering marvels, but the mastabas are artistic ones. Consider the mastaba of Mereruka, the largest non-royal tomb at Saqqara, built during the 6th dynasty for the vizier of Pharaoh Teti. This single structure contains 32 rooms. 32. It is not a tomb, it is a mansion. An underground palace filled with painted and carved reliefs depicting every aspect of the vizier's life and afterlife. Mereruka was the most powerful official in Egypt after the kings himself. He married a daughter of the pharaoh. He held more titles than any other official of his era, and his tomb reflects that status, with an ambition that borders on the royal. The reliefs in Mereruka's mastaba show scenes of hunting in the marshes, of metal workers smelting copper and gold, of dwarfs crafting jewelry, of cattle being force-fed for fattening, of hyenas being tamed and domesticated for hunting. There are scenes of acrobats performing backbends, scenes of children playing games, scenes of boats sailing on the Nile, their sails catching the wind, their crews hauling ropes and adjusting rigging. The level of detail is staggering. Individual fish species can be identified in the fishing scenes, individual plant species in the agricultural ones. The mastaba is an encyclopedia of Egyptian life, rendered in limestone and paint. covering roughly 800 square meters of wall surface. And in the center of the main offering hall, Mereruka himself emerges from a niche in the wall, a life-sized painted statue of the vizier, stepping forward out of the stone as if he were walking from the realm of the dead into the world of the living. This statue is not freestanding. It is carved from the wall itself. The vizier is part of the architecture. He is the mastaba. The building and the man are one. Jacques de Morgan, who first excavated Mereruka's tomb in 1892, understood that he had found something exceptional. But the first comprehensive publication of the tomb did not appear until 1936, more than 4 decades later, when Prentice Duell produced a detailed photographic and descriptive record. By then, some of the painted surfaces had already deteriorated. Colours that were vivid in 1892 were faded by 1936, and they have continued to fade since. The mastaba of Meruka, like all open tombs, is being slowly destroyed by the very act of being known. This is the villain that the mastabas face today. Not robbers. The robbers did their work centuries ago. Not sand. The sand that once buried the tombs actually protected them. The villain is exposure. Light, air, moisture, human breath, and the vibrations of modern traffic all contribute to the deterioration of the painted and carved surfaces. The reliefs that Mariette saw in 1865 when he uncovered the mastaba of T, reliefs that had been sealed in darkness for 4,000 years, are now subjected to the daily assault of the modern environment. Visitors enter the tombs and exhale moisture. Camera flashes bleach the pigments. Dust carried on clothing settles on the walls. The cumulative effect, multiplied across millions of visits over 150 years, is visible and measurable. Conservation efforts have mitigated the damage, but cannot halt it entirely. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has installed climate control systems in some of the most important mastabas, limiting the number of visitors and monitoring temperature and humidity. International teams have digitized key tombs, creating high-resolution photographic archives that capture the current state of the reliefs before further deterioration occurs. But the pace of loss is relentless. Every year, the painted walls of the Old Kingdom Mastabas are slightly less vivid, slightly less detailed, slightly less legible than they were the year before. The slow erasure that began when the first robber broke through a mud brick wall 5,000 years ago continues now, in a different form, at a different speed, but with the same inevitable outcome. The mastabas are dying, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, measurably, irreversibly. The houses for eternity are losing the very details that make them eternal. The colours, the carvings, the faces on the walls. The stone will remain, the art will not. And when the art is gone, the mastaba will be what its critics have always called it, a flat rectangle of weathered stone, indistinguishable from the desert, invisible beneath the shadow of the pyramids. The race between preservation and decay is the mastaba's final challenge, and it is a race that preservation ultimately cannot win. It can only postpone the outcome. The question is how much of the record can be captured, photographed, scanned, published, shared, before the originals fade beyond recovery. The digital age has given us tools that Mariette and Emery could not have imagined. But those tools are only as good as the funding, the access, and the political will that support their use. And funding, access, and political will are not permanent. They are, like the mortuary cults that once sustained the mastabas, institutional commitments that can be withdrawn at any time. And there is one more dimension to the mastaba's core problem, one that connects the ancient structures to the modern world in a way that few archaeological sites can match. The mastabas are not just tombs for the dead, they are archives for the living, and the information they contain about agriculture, technology, social organization, diet, disease, labor practices, trade networks, artistic conventions, and religious belief is irreplaceable. No other source provides the same breadth and depth of information about daily life in ancient Egypt. The papyri are fragmentary. The temple inscriptions are focused on royal propaganda. The royal tombs are bare, but the mastabas are comprehensive. They depict everything, and what they depict is not myth or ideology. It is life. the actual, mundane, extraordinary, banal, productive life of a civilization that existed for 3,000 years on the banks of the most fertile river in Africa. The agricultural scenes alone have transformed our understanding of Old Kingdom farming. The reliefs in the mastaba of tea show the full cycle of grain production: ploughing, sowing, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, and storage. They show the tools used at each stage. They show the animals involved. They show the supervision and the hierarchy: overseers watching workers, scribes recording yields, granary managers inspecting stores. From these scenes, scholars have reconstructed the agricultural calendar of the Old Kingdom, the crop rotation practices, the irrigation methods, and the labor organization. None of this information exists in any written document from the period. It exists only on tomb walls. The craft scenes are equally revealing. In the mastabas of the 6th dynasty, scenes of metalworking show bellows being operated to raise the temperature of charcoal furnaces, molten copper being poured into molds, and finished tools being hammered on anvils. Scenes of boat building show planks being lashed together with rope, the same technique used in the full-sized boats found buried beside the Great Pyramid. Scenes of weaving show horizontal looms of a type that was used in Egypt for millennia. Scenes of pottery making show the use of the slow wheel, a turntable that allowed the potter to rotate the vessel during shaping, predating the fast wheel by centuries. Each of these scenes is a data point. Each data point connects to others, and together they form a picture of an economy that was more complex, more specialized, and more productive than most histories give it credit for. The Old Kingdom was not a society of pyramids and pharaohs alone. It was a society of bakers, brewers, butchers, fishermen, farmers, weavers, potters, metalworkers, carpenters, boat builders, and scribes, all of them depicted with loving detail on the walls of their employers' tombs. The mastabas are the working-class history of ancient Egypt, preserved not by the workers themselves, but by the elite who employed them and who believed, with touching sincerity, that they would need those workers in the afterlife, just as they had needed them in life. Let that sink in. The most detailed record of daily life in the ancient world was produced not out of curiosity, not out of a desire to document, but out of a magical belief that painted workers would become real workers in the next world. The most valuable historical source from ancient Egypt was created by accident, a side effect of theology. The tomb builders were trying to provision the dead. They ended up documenting the living, and the documentation, intended to serve one man's afterlife, now serves the understanding of an entire civilization. That is the core problem of the mastaba. It is the most informative, most revealing, most archaeologically valuable building type in the history of the Nile Valley. And it is the least famous, the least visited, the least celebrated, the least understood. The pyramids get the glory, the mastabas get the truth, and that truth extends even to the bodies themselves. When the mastabas are not entirely robbed, when the burial chamber still contains skeletal remains, the bones offer information that no relief can provide. Physical anthropologists examining remains from Old Kingdom mastabas have documented arthritis in the spines of heavy labourers, evidence of healed fractures in the limbs of workers, dental wear patterns that reveal diets heavy in stone-ground grain, and nutritional deficiencies that indicate periodic famine even among the elite. Some remains show evidence of ancient surgical procedures. Trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull, has been documented in several cases, with healing around the edges of the holes, indicating that the patients survived the operation. These bones are not anonymous relics. They are medical records, the oldest clinical data in the history of medicine, preserved by the dry desert environment that the mastabas builders chose, perhaps without fully understanding why, as the best place to house the dead. The mastabas of the First Dynasty, with their subsidiary burials, offer even more disturbing physical evidence. The bodies found in the retainer graves at Abydos have been examined for cause of death. Some show signs of cervical vertebra damage consistent with strangulation. Others show no obvious cause of death, leading to speculation about poisoning or bloodletting. The young ages of the retainers, most were between 20 and 25, suggest that they were not elderly servants who had died naturally and were honoured with burial near the king. They were young, healthy individuals whose deaths coincided with the king's funeral. The simplest explanation is that they were killed. The kindest explanation is that they volunteered. Neither explanation is comfortable. The practice of retainer sacrifice is the darkest chapter in the Mastabas story. It lasted for roughly 150 years, from the reign of Horaha to the late First Dynasty, and then it stopped. The reasons for its cessation are debated. Did the kings decide it was wasteful? Did the elite resist the sacrifice of their own members? Did theological developments provide an alternative? The magical servant statues called Ushapti, which would later populate every tomb in Egypt, standing in for the living workers who had once been killed to serve the dead. Whatever the reason, the end of retainer sacrifice marks one of the most significant moral transitions in human history. A society that had practiced ritualized killing as part of its highest religious ceremony chose, within a few generations, to replace the killed servants with symbolic substitutes. The Ushabti, small carved figures, sometimes hundreds of them in a single tomb, are the descendants of the retainer graves at Abydos. They are the stone and wood and faience surrogates for the living people who would have been killed 500 years earlier. The mastaba was the setting for both practices, for the sacrifice and for the substitute, and the evolution from one to the other, visible in the archaeological record across the first 5 centuries of Egyptian dynastic history, is a story about the capacity of a civilization to change its mind about the most fundamental question it faces. What price are we willing to pay for the afterlife? The mastabas answer that question differently across different periods. In the First Dynasty, the answer was everything. Life itself could be spent. By the Third Dynasty, the answer had changed. Life was spared. Stone took its place. And the mastaba, the flat, solid, enduring house for eternity, evolved to accommodate the new answer. Ushapti replaced retainers. Painted scenes replaced real provisions. False doors replaced real doorways. Magic replaced matter. And the result, paradoxically, was a richer, more humane, and a more informative burial tradition than the one it replaced. The pyramids are the monuments everyone knows, but the mastabas are the monuments that document the journey, from human sacrifice to magical substitution, from mud brick to limestone, from flat bench to towering stairway, from the first scratched hieroglyph on an ivory label to the sprawling painted encyclopedia of the Old Kingdom tomb wall. The mastaba is where the story of Egyptian civilization was written, not in the grand gestures of the pharaohs, but in the patient, accumulating details of 1,000 individual lives, each one recorded on the walls of a house that was meant to last forever, and each one, in its way, still speaking if anyone cares to listen. Take the individual mastabas one by one. Each one is a world. Each one tells a different story about how the Egyptians thought about death, about power, about the things worth saving from oblivion. Begin at Abydos. Begin with the oldest. Begin with the tomb of Horaha, the first pharaoh of a united Egypt, or perhaps the second, depending on whether you identify the legendary means with Horaha or with his predecessor Nana. Built his tomb in the desert cemetery at el-Kab, the same cemetery where generations of pre-dynastic rulers had been buried before him. His tomb, designated B19 and B15 by archaeologists, was not a single structure but a cluster of chambers. 3 large chambers surrounded by rows of subsidiary graves. The central chambers were lined with mud brick and roofed with timber. Inside, Petrie found traces of what had once been a rich burial: pottery vessels, ivory objects, and the remains of wooden furniture that had long since crumbled to dust. But the subsidiary graves were the revelation. 36 small chambers, each containing a body, arranged in rows to the east and north of the royal tomb. And near the funerary enclosure, a separate walled compound, roughly 1.5 kilometers from the tomb, where ritual activities were performed. 6 more subsidiary graves were found. The bodies in those 6 graves, excavated by a team from the University of Pennsylvania in the early 2000s, showed the strongest archaeological evidence yet found for retainer sacrifice in Egypt. All were young males. All had died at approximately the same time. Some showed signs of physical trauma. The lead excavators concluded that these individuals had been killed as part of the king's funeral ceremony. Petrie, working more than a century earlier, had noted the same pattern but expressed caution. He wrote that the evidence was too tenuous to say with any certainty whether the subsidiary burials were sacrificial or voluntary. That caution is characteristic of Petrie, a man who revolutionized field archaeology by insisting on the careful recording of every object, however mundane, and who understood that the absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence. But the more recent excavations, with their access to modern forensic techniques, have made the sacrificial interpretation harder to dismiss. Horaha's tomb is not a monument. It is not visually impressive. It is a collection of mud brick rooms in the desert, mostly collapsed, their walls eroded to stumps. A visitor standing at El Kab today would see low mounds, scattered pottery, and a few archaeological markers. Nothing that announces the presence of the first king, of the first dynasty, of the first unified kingdom in the history of the Nile Valley. The mastaba of Horaha is invisible in the way that all beginnings are invisible, recognizable only in retrospect, only after what came next has been understood. Now move north, move to Saqqara, move forward in time by roughly 200 years, past the first dynasty and into the third, and stand in front of the structure that changed everything. The mastaba of Hezi-Re, third dynasty, reign of Djoser. The same reign that produced the Step Pyramid, the first pyramid in history. Hezi-Re was a contemporary of Imhotep. He held the title Chief Dentist and Physician of the King, one of the most intriguing titles in the Old Kingdom, suggesting that dental and medical expertise were already specialized professions 5,000 years ago. His mastaba, excavated at Saqqara, is one of the earliest to show the transition from the niched, palace-facade exterior of the First Dynasty to the smoother, more austere exterior of the later Old Kingdom. The walls are simpler. The focus has shifted from the outside to the inside, and the inside is where the innovation lies. Hezi-Re's tomb contained the earliest known examples of false doors, the carved stone panels that became the focal point of every subsequent mastaba in Egyptian history. These false doors were set into niches along the western wall of the offering corridor, and in front of each one was a small shelf or table where food offerings could be placed. The ka of the deceased would emerge through the false door, consume the spiritual essence of the offerings, and return to the burial chamber. It was a simple, elegant, and enormously influential design, the theological engine of the mastaba, the mechanism by which the dead were fed, and in those niches, Hezi-Re's carvers placed the extraordinary wooden panels that are now among the treasures of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. 6 panels originally, of which 5 survive. Each shows the tomb owner in a different pose, standing, seated, striding forward, rendered with an anatomical precision that is breathtaking given the period. The musculature of the arms and legs is clearly defined. The tools of the scribe, palette, pen case, water pot, are depicted with the specificity of a technical drawing. These panels are not decoration. They are portraiture of the highest order, produced at the very dawn of the monumental tradition, more than 2 centuries before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now move forward again, move to the 5th dynasty, move to the mastaba that, more than any other, defined the modern world's understanding of daily life in ancient Egypt. The mastaba of Ti, built around 2400 BC according to current estimates. Discovered by Auguste Mariette in 1865, located in the northern sector of the Saqqara necropolis, roughly 500 meters northwest of the Step Pyramid, and containing within its limestone walls the most comprehensive and beautifully executed visual record of Old Kingdom life ever found. Tai was not a king. He was not even of royal blood by birth. He was a senior administrator, a man who rose through the ranks of the 5th dynasty bureaucracy to become one of the most powerful officials in Egypt. His wife, Neferhet's, was a priestess of Neith and Hathor and was related to the royal family, which meant that Ti's children were considered of royal descent. This combination of administrative power and royal connection made Ti wealthy enough to build one of the largest and most elaborate non-royal tombs in the Saqqara necropolis. The tomb's layout is a masterclass in Old Kingdom funerary architecture. The entrance leads through a portico, one of the earliest known examples in a private tomb, into a large columned courtyard with 12 square pillars. This courtyard, open to the sky, served as a gathering space for the priests and visitors who maintained Ti's funerary cult. In the center of the courtyard is a vertical burial shaft, descending to the underground chamber where Ti's sarcophagus was found. Empty, as always, the grave goods long since stolen. But the courtyard is only the beginning. Beyond it, 2 corridors lead to the heart of the tomb, the main offering hall, whose walls are covered with reliefs that have been described as the finest non-royal art of the Old Kingdom. The famous hippopotamus hunt scene dominates the northern wall. Ti stands on a papyrus boat in the marshes, towering over his servants, while beneath the waterline, hippopotami thrash among the reeds and a crocodile seizes a smaller animal. The scene is at once peaceful and violent. The calm authority of the tomb owner contrasted with the chaotic energy of the natural world below. On other walls, the full cycle of agricultural production unfolds in sequential panels, ploughing with wooden ploughs and oxen, sowing grain by hand, harvesting with copper sickles, threshing by driving cattle over the cut stalks, winnowing by tossing the grain in the air so that the wind carries away the chaff, and finally storing the cleaned grain in beehive-shaped granaries. Each panel flows into the next. The effect is cinematic, a moving image, 5,000 years before the invention of film. Elsewhere in the tomb, scenes of boat building show every stage of construction: the shaping of planks, the boring of holes for lashing, the assembly of the hull, the application of pitch. Scenes of market activity show goods being traded and disputes being adjudicated. Scenes of metalworking show bellows operators stoking furnace fires. And throughout, the figure of Ti appears, supervising, inspecting, presiding, the organizing intelligence at the center of a complex, productive, well-ordered world. Mariette, who found the tomb almost completely buried in sand, was overwhelmed by what he uncovered. The reliefs were in extraordinary condition, the colors still vivid after more than 4 millennia of sealed darkness. He cleaned, documented, and opened the tomb to visitors, beginning a tradition of access that continues today. The mastaba of Ti is now one of the most visited non-royal tombs in Egypt, and its reliefs have been reproduced in countless books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions. It is, in many ways, the public face of the Egyptian mastaba, the structure that most people picture when they hear the term. But Ti's tomb, for all its fame, is only one example. Move forward in time once more, to the 6th dynasty, to the very end of the Old Kingdom, and encounter a mastaba of a different scale and a different ambition entirely. The mastaba of Mereruka, vizier of Pharaoh Teti, son-in-law of the king, the most powerful non-royal person in Egypt during his lifetime, and the owner of the largest and most elaborate non-royal tomb ever built at Saqqara, a structure of 32 rooms, covering an area that rivals some royal temples, its walls alive with carved and painted reliefs that depict not just daily life, but the full spectrum of human activity in the Old Kingdom. Mereruka's tomb was discovered in 1892 by Jacques de Morgan, who recognized its exceptional quality but did not have the resources to publish it fully. That task fell to Prentice Duell, whose comprehensive photographic and descriptive record of the tomb, published in 1936, remains the standard reference, and the reliefs that Duell documented are extraordinary, not just for their artistic quality, but for their range. In Mereruka's tomb, you can see scenes of acrobatics and physical exercise, women performing backbends, men wrestling and sparring. You can see scenes of children playing, their games depicted with an attention to posture and expression that suggests the artist was working from direct observation. You can see scenes of hyenas being force-fed, tamed wild animals fattened for the table, a practice documented nowhere else in Egyptian art. You can see dwarfs crafting jewelry, small figures working with delicate tools, their proportions clearly differentiated from those of the full-sized adults around them. And you can see, in the main offering hall, the full-sized painted statue of Mereruka stepping out of a niche in the wall, a 3-dimensional figure emerging from a 2-dimensional surface, as if the boundary between art and reality had been dissolved. This statue, the Ka statue of Mereruka, is one of the most famous individual artworks from the Old Kingdom. It stands roughly 2 meters tall. It shows the vizier striding forward, his left foot advanced, his arms at his sides, his face serene and confident. The statue is not a portrait in the modern sense. It does not capture the vizier's individual features with photographic accuracy, but it captures something more elusive, the idea of authority, of presence, of a man who commanded the resources of an empire and who expected to command them for eternity. The rooms dedicated to Mereruka's wife, Watet Kethor, and his son, Meriteti, are separately decorated with their own relief programs, scenes of offering, scenes of daily life, and false doors with their own inscriptions. The mastaba is not a single tomb, but a family complex, a multi-generational burial structure that housed 3 members of one family across 3 suites of rooms. This is the mastaba at its most expansive, no longer a simple rectangular tomb but a compound, a residence, a palace of the dead that dwarfs many of the pyramid temples built for the kings themselves. And this is where the story of the mastaba reaches its climax and its crisis. The 6th dynasty mastabas at Saqqara are not just large. They are, in some cases, larger and more elaborately decorated than the royal pyramids of the same period. The pyramids of the late Old Kingdom, the pyramids of Teti, Pepi I, Merenri and Pepi II, are small by the standards of the 4th dynasty. They are poorly constructed, built with rubble cores and limestone casings that have largely collapsed. Their interiors, while historically important, they contain the first inscribed pyramid texts, the oldest religious literature in Egypt, are cramped and austere compared to the spacious, vividly decorated rooms of the neighbouring mastabas. The shift in resources is visible. By the 6th dynasty, the power and wealth of the Egyptian state were being redistributed. The pharaoh was no longer the sole patron of monumental architecture. The provincial governors, the viziers, the high priests, the men who ran the empire on a day-to-day basis were accumulating enough resources to build tombs that rivaled the king's. The mastaba, which had begun as a form reserved for royalty, had become the instrument of an ascendant aristocracy, and the pyramids, which had replaced the mastaba as the royal tomb, were shrinking. This redistribution would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Old Kingdom itself. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2180 BC, the central authority of the pharaoh had been so thoroughly undermined by the power of provincial officials that the kingdom fractured. The first intermediate period, a time of political fragmentation, social upheaval, and reduced monumental building, followed, and the mastabas of the late Old Kingdom, with their extravagant decoration and their vast scale, are the architectural evidence of the forces that brought the Pyramid Age to an end. The men who built those mastabas were not rebelling against the king. They were simply building tombs that matched their actual power, and the fact that their tombs outshone the king's was a symptom, not a cause, of the Old Kingdom's decline. The mastaba, in its final Old Kingdom expression, is both a triumph and a warning. A triumph of art, of engineering, of human ambition, and a warning about what happens when the resources of a state are captured by its elite. When the men who serve the king become wealthier than the king himself, and when the tombs they build for themselves announce that shift for all eternity. But there are mastabas beyond Saqqara, mastabas that tell stories the Saqqara tombs cannot. Move east to the Giza Plateau and consider the mastaba fields that surround the 3 great pyramids. Here, in the western and eastern cemeteries of Giza, hundreds of mastabas from the 4th dynasty are arranged in precise grid patterns, rows and columns of rectangular tombs, laid out with the same geometric precision that governed the placement of the pyramids themselves. These mastabas belong to the officials, priests, and family members of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. They were built as part of the same construction program that produced the pyramids by the same workers, using the same materials, and their orderly arrangement reveals something important about the 4th dynasty state, that even death was administered by central planning. George Reisner, who spent decades mapping these mastaba fields, described the Giza cemeteries as a city of the dead, planned with the same regularity as the streets of a modern town. The comparison is apt. Each mastaba occupies a specific plot. Each plot was assigned to a specific individual based on their rank and their relationship to the king. The closest plots, the ones adjacent to the royal pyramid, went to the king's closest relatives and most trusted officials. The plots farther away went to lesser figures. The entire necropolis is a social hierarchy rendered in stone, a permanent three-dimensional organizational chart of the 4th dynasty elite. The Giza mastabas are also significant for what they lack. Unlike the richly decorated mastabas of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the 4th dynasty mastabas at Giza are often austere, their exterior walls plain, their interiors limited to a few small rooms with modest decoration. The emphasis in the 4th dynasty was on the king's monument, not on the tombs of his officials. The resources went upward, into the pyramids. The mastabas were secondary. This relative austerity is itself informative. It tells us that the 4th dynasty pharaohs controlled the distribution of resources to an extraordinary degree. No official could build a tomb that rivaled the king's. The mastaba was kept in its place. The pyramid was supreme. That control loosened with each successive dynasty. By the 5th dynasty, the decorated mastabas of officials like T show a level of investment that would have been unthinkable under Khufu. By the 6th dynasty, the mastabas of viziers like Meroruka surpass some royal monuments in scale and decoration. The trajectory is clear. As the power of the pharaoh waned, the power of the elite waxed, and the mastaba, the universal tomb form, the building type that served everyone from the first pharaoh to the last vizier, recorded that shift in real time. Now consider one more site. Return to Abydos. Return to where the story began. But move forward in time, past the 1st dynasty, past the subsidiary burials, past the retainer graves, to a period roughly 1,000 years later, the Middle Kingdom, the 12th dynasty, around 1900 BC. By this time, Abydos had been transformed. It was no longer simply a royal cemetery. It had become the holiest site in Egypt, the place where Osiris, the god of the dead, was believed to have been buried. Pilgrims from across Egypt came to Abydos to participate in the annual festival of Osiris, and many of those pilgrims built small mastabas, cenotaphs, or memorial stelae along the processional route. Modest structures, much smaller than the 1st dynasty royal tombs, but deeply personal. These are not the tombs of pharaohs, they are the tombs of ordinary Egyptians, officials, merchants, soldiers, priests, who wanted to be near the god of the dead in perpetuity. The Middle Kingdom mastabas at Abydos are tiny compared to the Old Kingdom ones at Saqqara, but they carry a different emotional weight. Each one represents an individual, a named person, with a known title, a known family, a known prayer. The stelae that marked these mastabas bear the offering formula. The standard prayer that begins Hetepdi Nisu, an offering that the king gives, and asks for bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, and everything good and pure on which a god lives for the ka of the deceased. This formula, repeated on thousands of stelae across hundreds of years, in countless sites across Egypt, began in the mastabas of the early dynastic period and reached its most widespread use in the Middle Kingdom. It is perhaps the most frequently inscribed text in human history, and it was written, always, on a mastaba or its equivalent, on a house for eternity. The mastaba form persisted, in one version or another, for the entire 3,000-year span of ancient Egyptian civilization. It was there at the beginning, the first royal tombs of the 1st dynasty. It was there at the peak, the magnificent decorated tombs of the Old Kingdom. It was there at the end, the modest cenotaphs of Abydos. And it was there alongside the pyramids, beneath them, around them, always the supporting structure, always the form that everyone, king, queen, vizier, priest, scribe, soldier, merchant, could claim as their own. The pyramid was the innovation, the mastaba was the tradition, and tradition, in Egypt, outlasted everything. And there is one more mastaba that demands attention, one that bridges the gap between the 1st dynasty blood tombs and the Old Kingdom art galleries in a single, unforgettable archaeological moment. The mastaba of Hemeka, 1st dynasty, reign of King Den, Saqqara. Hemeka was a high official, possibly the vizier, of one of the most significant kings of the 1st dynasty. Den is credited with numerous innovations. The first known stone floor in a tomb, the first use of granite for architectural elements, the first royal visit to the Nile Delta recorded on a label. His reign, lasting perhaps 50 years, was one of the longest of the early dynastic period, and Hemeka, his chief official, was buried in a mastaba that Emery considered one of the most important discoveries of his career. Mastaba S. 3035, 57 meters long, 26 meters wide, built of mud brick, with the characteristic palace facade niching on its exterior walls. Inside, Emery found magazines, storage rooms filled with grave goods that had survived the robbers. And among those goods were objects that pushed the beginning of Egyptian material culture far earlier than anyone had expected. Emery found stone discs, circular plates of schist and alabaster, some with incised geometric patterns, some plain, all extraordinarily thin and perfectly symmetrical. Their purpose is debated. Some scholars believe they were components of a game. Others believe they were tokens of some kind, administrative tools, ritual objects, or offerings. Whatever they were, their craftsmanship was astonishing. They were produced using techniques, precise cutting, polishing, and shaping of hard stone, that imply the existence of advanced workshop traditions at a period usually characterized as primitive. He also found ink inscriptions on pottery, some of the earliest known examples of the hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphic writing that would later be used for administrative documents, letters, and literary texts. These inscriptions were not monumental. They were practical, notes, labels, inventories. But their presence in a First Dynasty mastaba means that cursive writing, the everyday, practical form of literacy, was already in use more than 5,000 years ago. Writing was not a luxury of the late Old Kingdom. It was a tool of the early state, embedded in the bureaucratic apparatus from the very beginning. And we know this because Hemarka's mastaba preserved the evidence. The tomb also contained the earliest known example of a papyrus roll, blank, unused, but carefully stored alongside other grave goods. Papyrus, the writing material that would become synonymous with Egyptian civilization, was already being produced in the First Dynasty. The technology was ready. The medium was available. Whatever the earliest Egyptians were writing, they were writing it on papyrus, as well as on ivory, bone, and pottery. The papyrus from Hemarka's tomb has not survived in readable condition. The organic material has degraded beyond recovery, but its presence tells us that the loss of early Egyptian literature is not because the Egyptians were not writing. It is because the material on which they wrote did not last. The papyrus rotted, the ivory crumbled, the pottery shattered, and the mastaba, the structure that preserved these fragments, is the only reason we know the writing existed at all. One more mastaba, one more story. The mastaba of Tahatep and Akhethotep, 5th Dynasty, Saqqara. This double mastaba, shared by a father and son, both of whom held high administrative positions, contains some of the most famous reliefs in Egyptian art. The scene of Ptahhotep at his offering table, surrounded by bearers bringing food, is reproduced in virtually every textbook of Egyptian art. The scene of the cattle crossing the river, with calves being carried on the shoulders of herdsmen while their mothers swim alongside. Bellowing is one of the most emotionally expressive scenes in the entire Old Kingdom repertoire. It is not just a depiction of agriculture, it is a depiction of anxiety. The cow calling to her calf across the water, the herdsman struggling under the weight of the animal, the river current pulling at their legs. It is a scene that anyone who has ever worked with animals can understand immediately, regardless of the cultural or temporal distance. It is universal, and that universality is what the mastabas offer that the pyramids cannot. The pyramids speak of power, the mastabas speak of life. The pyramids are abstract, geometric perfection, mathematical precision, cosmological alignment. The mastabas are concrete, real people doing real things, rendered with an attention to detail that borders on the obsessive. The pyramids inspire awe, the mastabas inspire recognition. Looking at the scene of the cattle crossing in Ptahhotep's tomb, you do not think, how impressive. You think, I have seen that. I know that moment. The mastaba connects you to a world 5,000 years gone, not through its scale, but through its specificity. Not through what it demands you feel, but through what it allows you to see. This is not science fiction. This is the archaeological record, speaking in its own voice, through the medium of a building type that most histories mention only as a footnote to the pyramid. The mastaba is not the preliminary sketch. It is the detailed drawing. It is not the rough draft. It is the finished work. And the story it tells of 500 years of evolution, from mud brick pit to limestone palace, from retainer sacrifice to painted paradise, is the origin story of Egyptian civilization itself. And yet, ask 100 people what they know about ancient Egypt, and 99 will mention pyramids. Ask them what a mastaba is, and most will not know. The most informative building type in the ancient world is also the most anonymous. The form that held everything, the bodies, the art, the writing, the evidence, is the form that history forgot. The forgetting is not accidental, it is structural. The pyramids survive as freestanding monuments, visible from kilometers away, photographable from every angle, instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever opened a textbook or watched a documentary. The mastabas do not. They survive as low, eroded rectangles of stone, often partially buried, often indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain, often accessible only through narrow doorways that lead underground. The mastaba is a building that hides. Its exterior is plain, its treasures are interior. You have to enter one to understand what it is. And entering a 5,000-year-old tomb in the desert requires access, permission, guidance, and a willingness to step underground. Barriers that keep the mastabas invisible to most visitors and, by extension, to most of the world. The serdab is a perfect example of this hiddenness. The serdab, from the Arabic word for cellar, is a sealed room within a mastaba, typically located behind the false door, that contains one or more statues of the deceased. The serdab has no entrance, it has no door. It is completely sealed, accessible only through one or two small holes in the wall. Holes through which the incense from the offering rituals could reach the statues inside, and through which the ka of the deceased could peer out at the world of the living. The serdab statues are among the most extraordinary works of art from the Old Kingdom. They are often painted, the skin in natural tones, the eyes inlaid with crystal and quartz to create an unsettling lifelike gaze. The famous statue of the scribe Kaapa, found in a serdab at Saqqara and now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is so realistic that when the workmen who uncovered it saw it emerge from the sand, they reportedly exclaimed, "Sheikh el-Balad," the village chief, because it resembled their own headman. The statue is made of sycamore wood, stands roughly 112 centimeters tall, and depicts a portly, dignified man with a round face and a confident expression. It is one of the earliest known examples of realistic portraiture in the history of art, and it was found inside a sealed room in a mastaba at Saqqara. The serdab was the mastaba's most intimate space, the room closest to the identity of the deceased. The false door was the portal, the offering table was the altar, but the serdab was the presence, the place where the dead person continued to exist in three-dimensional form. And the existence was intentionally hidden. The serdab had no public face. It was not meant to be seen by visitors. It was meant to be felt, a presence behind the wall, looking out through the peepholes, watching the rituals, receiving the offerings, existing in eternal concealed awareness. This architecture of concealment is the mastaba's defining characteristic. Everything important is inside. Everything visible is austere. The building presents a blank face to the world and reserves its richness for the interior, for the deceased, for the priests, for the gods. The pyramid is the opposite. Everything important about the pyramid is visible: the shape, the size, the alignment. The interior of the Great Pyramid, while architecturally complex, is famously devoid of decoration. The mastaba and the pyramid are complementary opposites, one all interior, the other all exterior, and the civilization that produced both understood that you needed both, the visible and the hidden, the public and the private, the monument and the archive. We have inherited the monument. We have neglected the archive. And the archive is where the real story lives. Consider one final detail that illustrates the depth of information the mastabas contain. In several Old Kingdom mastabas at Saqqara and Giza, the painted reliefs include scenes of the tomb construction itself, images of workers building the very tomb in which the images appear. These scenes show stonemasons cutting blocks, plasterers smoothing walls, painters applying color, and sculptors carving statues. They are meta-scenes, images about image making, art about the making of art, and they are profoundly informative. From these construction scenes, scholars have learned how Old Kingdom artists organized their work. The scenes show a division of labor, separate specialists for cutting, smoothing, drawing, carving, and painting. They show the use of grids, red lines drawn on the wall to guide the proportions of the figures. They show the sequence of work, outline first, then rough carving, then fine carving, then painting. They show the tools, copper chisels, wooden mallets, reed brushes, pigment pots, and they show the human organization, foremen supervising, scribes recording, apprentices assisting. This information exists nowhere else. No papyrus from the Old Kingdom describes the process of tomb decoration. No inscription explains how the artists worked. The only source is the art itself, the scenes in the mastabas that depict their own creation. The mastaba is self-documenting. It contains, within its own walls, the instructions for understanding how it was made. And those instructions, painted 5,000 years ago by artists who had no idea they were contributing to the history of art, are now among the most important sources for understanding the methods and materials of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship. The mastaba does not just contain history, it contains the history of how history was made, and that recursive quality, the archive that archives itself, the tomb that documents its own construction, is unique in the ancient world. No Greek temple depicts its own building. No Roman villa shows its own decoration being applied. No Mesopotamian ziggurat contains images of its own brickwork. Only the Egyptian mastaba looks at itself and says, "This is how I came to be. This is how I was made. Remember me. Remember how." There is one more dimension to the mastaba story that deserves attention before we move to the deeper implications, and that is the mastaba as a social document. The decorated mastabas of the Old Kingdom are not neutral records, they are statements, curated presentations of the tomb owner's life, designed to project a specific image for eternity. And the choices that the tomb owners made, what to include, what to exclude, how to present themselves, are as revealing as the content itself. The tomb owner is almost always depicted as the largest figure in the scene. Larger than his wife, larger than his servants, larger than any other person. This is not because the tomb owner was physically the tallest person in the room. It is a convention of Egyptian art called hieratic scaling, the principle that the size of a figure in a scene reflects their social importance, not their physical stature. The pharaoh is always the largest. The vizier is larger than the scribe. The scribe is larger than the farmer. The art is a map of power, rendered in proportional relationships. The tomb owner's wife appears in many mastabas, but almost always in a subsidiary role, standing behind her husband at the offering table, accompanying him on hunting expeditions, receiving offerings of her own in a smaller chamber. In the mastaba of Mereruka, his wife Tetkethor has her own suite of 6 rooms, separately decorated, with her own false door and her own offering scenes. This is exceptional. In most mastabas, the wife appears as a supporting figure, present but not central. Her name is recorded, her titles are inscribed. But the tomb is not hers, it is his. She is a guest in his eternity. This gendered hierarchy in the mastabas has been the subject of considerable scholarly attention. Some researchers have argued that the subordinate position of women in tomb art reflects their subordinate position in Old Kingdom society. Others have argued that the art follows its own conventions, that a woman depicted at a smaller scale beside her husband was not necessarily subordinate in life, merely depicted according to the rules of a system that prioritized male authority in the funerary context. The debate is unresolved, but the mastabas are the primary evidence, the visual record from which any argument about gender in the Old Kingdom must ultimately derive. The occupational scenes in the mastabas also reveal the structure of the Old Kingdom economy in ways that written records do not. The scenes show specialization: dedicated bread makers, dedicated beer brewers, dedicated fishermen, dedicated herdsmen. Each trade has its own tools, its own techniques, its own postures. The butchering scenes, for example, are remarkably consistent across different mastabas. The same sequence of cuts, the same positioning of the animal, the same gestures by the butcher. This consistency suggests that butchering was a standardized trade, practiced according to established methods, and that the artists who depicted it were working from direct observation of a real and repeatable process. The fishing scenes show at least 2 distinct methods: net fishing from boats and line fishing from the bank, each appropriate to different conditions and different species. The scenes of bird trapping show the use of a large hexagonal clap net, operated by a team of men who hide in the reeds and pull the net shut when birds land on the bait. This technique is documented nowhere else in the ancient world with such precision. The mastaba reliefs are, effectively, a technical manual for Old Kingdom fishing and fowling, a how-to guide for activities that sustained the Egyptian population for millennia. And the agricultural scenes, as already noted, provide the most complete visual record of pre-modern farming practices anywhere in the world. The ploughing scenes show the use of a simple scratch plough, a wooden beam tipped with a pointed end drawn by a pair of oxen. This plough does not turn the soil, it scratches a furrow. It is a technology perfectly adapted to the soft, flood-deposited soil of the Nile Valley, where deep ploughing is unnecessary and where the annual flood refreshes the soil each year. The mastaba reliefs show this technology in operation, and in doing so, they explain why Egyptian agriculture was so productive with such simple tools. The answer is not in the tools, it is in the soil. And the mastabas document the relationship between technology and environment with a precision that no written record could match. The mastabas are, in the most literal sense, the visual archive of ancient Egyptian civilization. And the archive is deteriorating. The painted surfaces are fading, the carved reliefs are weathering. The structures themselves are subject to the same forces of erosion and human impact that affect all ancient monuments. The work of documenting, conserving, and publishing the mastabas is ongoing, but it is a race against time, and the stakes are not merely academic. The information contained in the mastabas is irreplaceable. If it is lost forever. No other source can substitute for the visual record that the tomb builders created. No other source depicts the daily life of ancient Egypt with the same comprehensiveness, the same specificity, the same unflinching attention to the ordinary. The mastabas are the record, and the record is at risk. Slow down. Set aside the individual tombs. Step back from Saqqara and Abydos and Giza and look at the mastaba not as an archaeological object but as a philosophical one, because the mastaba answers a question that every civilization asks and that no civilization has ever fully resolved. How do you make the dead permanent? The mastaba's answer was comprehensive. Build a house, fill it with everything the dead person needs, seal it, staff it with priests, fund it with agricultural estates, decorate it with magical images that will provide for the dead, even if the physical offerings fail. Create a false door through which the car can emerge. Create a serdab to house the statue. Create an offering formula that visitors can recite for all time. Layer defense upon defense, system upon system, backup upon backup. The mastaba is not one answer. It is every answer, every strategy for defeating oblivion that the Egyptian mind could conceive, stacked into a single rectangular building and sealed for eternity. And every single strategy failed. The priests left, the estates were confiscated, the offerings stopped, the robbers broke in, the paintings faded, the statues were smashed or stolen, the false doors were pried from the walls, the serdabs were broken open, the mummies were unwrapped and discarded, the names on the stelae were worn smooth by wind and sand. Every system that the mastaba builders designed to preserve the dead was eventually defeated by the same forces that defeat everything: time, greed, neglect, and the simple mathematics of entropy. Let that sink in. 500 years of continuous refinement, thousands of tombs, millions of bricks, billions of hours of labor, and the result after 5,000 years is ruins. Beautiful ruins. Informative ruins. But ruins. And yet, and this is the part that rescues the story from nihilism, the mastabas did preserve something. Not what they were designed to preserve. Not the body. Not the car. Not the magical provisions for the afterlife. But something else. Something the builders did not intend and could not have imagined. They preserved the record of how people lived. The painted walls that were meant to feed the dead are now feeding the living, not with bread and beer, but with knowledge. The magical images that were meant to sustain one person's afterlife are now sustaining the understanding of an entire civilization. The mastaba failed as a tomb. It succeeded as a time capsule, and the failure is inseparable from the success, because the very features that made the mastaba a poor protector of the dead made it an excellent preserver of the living record. The sealed interior, designed to keep out the living, also kept out the elements. The thick stone walls, designed to resist robbers, also resisted erosion. The painted reliefs, designed to provide magical sustenance, also provided historical documentation. Every feature that served the dead was, inadvertently, also serving the future. This is not a lesson that the ancient Egyptians could have learned. They built the mastabas in earnest belief. Belief in the ka, in the ba, in the magical efficacy of the offering formula, in the power of the painted image to become real. They were not building archives, they were building tombs. The archival function was accidental, and yet it is the archival function that has endured. While the theological function, the primary purpose, has been inoperative for millennia. The parallel to our own time is uncomfortable. We build digital archives in the earnest belief that they will preserve our records for the future. We build cloud servers, redundant storage systems, and backup protocols with the same confidence that the mastaba builders brought to their stone and mortar. But the digital archive is no more permanent than the mastaba. It depends on institutions, power grids, server farms, software companies, governments that are no more eternal than the mortuary cults that once served the dead. When those institutions fail, and they will fail, as all institutions do, the archives will go dark, the servers will fall silent, and whatever information they contained will be lost. The mastabas lasted 5,000 years because they are made of stone and they sit in a desert. Stone does not need electricity. A desert does not need maintenance. The durability of the mastaba is passive. It survives by doing nothing, by simply existing in a dry, stable environment. Digital archives are the opposite. They survive only through continuous active effort, constant power, constant cooling, constant maintenance, constant migration from obsolete formats to current ones. The moment the effort stops, the archive dies. This is not science fiction. This is a comparison of technologies, and the comparison is not flattering to the digital age. The mastaba, for all its failures, has a demonstrated lifespan of 5 millennia. No digital storage medium has a demonstrated lifespan of 5 decades. The House for Eternity, made of mud brick and limestone, has outperformed every storage technology we have invented by a factor of 100. And the information inside the mastabas, the painted scenes, the carved reliefs, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, is accessible without any technology at all. You do not need a computer to read a tomb wall. You do not need software or a power source or an internet connection. You need eyes, you need a torch, you need perhaps a knowledge of hieroglyphs. But the information is there, on the wall, in a format that will remain readable as long as the wall itself stands. There is no format obsolescence. There is no codec incompatibility. There is no file corruption. The medium is the stone, the message is the paint, and both endure. We have forgotten this. We have become so enamored with the speed and convenience of digital technology that we have forgotten the most basic lesson of the mastaba, that durability and accessibility are not the same thing, and that the most durable records are the ones that require the least infrastructure to read. The mastaba builders knew this instinctively. They carved their messages into stone because stone survives. They painted their images in mineral pigments because mineral pigments do not fade the way organic dyes do. They built their walls thick because thick walls resist. Every choice they made, every material, every technique, every architectural decision was a bet on permanence. And the bets, while not perfect, were far better than ours. The deeper truth of the mastaba is not about ancient Egypt, it is about the nature of preservation itself. And the nature of preservation is this: the simpler the system, the longer it lasts, the fewer moving parts, the fewer points of failure, the less dependent on external support, the more resilient. The mastaba is a simple system. It is a box made of stone, sitting in a desert, containing images carved into its walls. It has no moving parts, it depends on nothing, and it has lasted 5,000 years. Our digital archives are complex systems. They have billions of moving parts. They depend on global infrastructure. And they will last how long? A century? A decade? No one knows. No one can know, because the technology has not existed long enough to be tested. The mastaba has been tested. 5,000 years of testing. And it passed. Not perfectly, but it passed. The walls are still there. The images are still there. The names, in many cases, are still legible. The House for Eternity did not deliver eternity, but it delivered something close enough to matter. And the fact that we have neglected this lesson, that we have built our civilization's memory on technologies that are orders of magnitude more fragile than mud brick and limestone, is perhaps the most troubling implication of the Mastabas story. We are, in a very real sense, less prepared for the future than the first dynasty Egyptians were. They knew that their records needed to survive for eternity. They built accordingly. We know that our records need to survive for, what? A generation? A century? We have not even asked the question. And the mastabas, standing in the desert, silent and patient, are asking it for us. But the mastaba offers one more truth, one that is not about technology or preservation or the mechanics of memory. It is about the relationship between the living and the dead. Every mastaba, from the simplest mud brick rectangle of the first dynasty to the 32-room palace of Meroruka, was designed around a single interaction, the offering. The living brought food and drink to the tomb. They placed it on the altar in front of the false door. They recited the offering formula, and through that act, that simple, repeated, profoundly human act of bringing sustenance to the dead, they maintained the connection between this world and the next. The offering was not a grand gesture. It was not a state ceremony. It was ordinary. Bread, beer, a jar of oil, a bundle of onions, the same things the living ate brought to the dead in the same form. The theology was sophisticated. The car consumed the spiritual essence while the physical food was later eaten by the priests. But the act itself was domestic. It was a meal, shared across the boundary of death, prepared by the living, consumed by the dead, and repeated day after day, year after year, generation after generation, for as long as the cult endured. This ritual of feeding the dead is one of the oldest documented religious practices in human history. It predates the mastabas. It predates the dynasties. It may predate civilization itself. The pre-dynastic pit burials at the earliest Egyptian sites often contain food offerings, suggesting that the impulse to feed the dead is as old as the impulse to bury them. But the mastaba formalized this impulse. It gave it a setting, the offering chapel. It gave it a focus, the false door. It gave it a text, the offering formula. And it gave it a permanence, the painted scenes on the walls, the magical images that would continue to provide sustenance even after the living stopped coming. The mastaba, at its deepest level, is a technology for maintaining relationships across the boundary of death. Not abstract relationships, not theological abstractions, personal relationships. A son feeding his father, a wife feeding her husband, a servant feeding his master. The mastaba does not deny death. It does not promise resurrection. It does not assert that the dead will live again in any conventional sense. It simply asserts that the dead still need to eat, and that the living still have the responsibility to feed them. This is not a belief that modern science can validate, but it is a belief that modern psychology can recognize. The impulse to care for the dead, to visit graves, to leave flowers, to maintain the physical spaces associated with departed loved ones, is universal. It appears in every culture, every era, every continent. The mastaba is the architectural expression of that impulse, and the fact that the Egyptians devoted more resources to that expression than any other civilization in history tells us something about the intensity with which they felt the obligation, and the depth of their anxiety about what would happen if the obligation were neglected. The mastaba was built to ensure that the dead would never go hungry, that the car would always be fed, that the relationship between the living and the dead would never be broken, and the fact that this relationship was broken, that the cults failed, that the offerings stopped, that the dead were eventually abandoned to the silence of the desert, is the mastaba's deepest grief. Not the loss of the body, not the loss of the gold, not the loss of the name, the loss of the connection, the moment when the last priest walked away from the last false door, and the dead were, for the first time, truly alone. That moment came differently for every tomb. For some mastabas, the cult lasted centuries. The agricultural estates that funded the priests continued to produce income for generations, and the offerings continued even as the dynasty that built the tomb was replaced by a new one. For others, the cult lasted only a generation. The son who was supposed to maintain his father's tomb died, or moved, or simply forgot. And for some, the cult may have lasted only a few years. The political upheavals of the later Old Kingdom disrupted everything, including the provision of the dead. But for every mastaba, the end came eventually. Every cult failed, every offering stopped, every false door fell silent, and the Purjet, the house for eternity, became at last what it had always been in physical fact, a box of stone in the desert, empty of provisions, empty of presence, inhabited only by the paintings on the walls and the bones in the burial chamber below. And yet, 5,000 years later, the paintings still speak. The bones still tell their stories. The stone still holds its shape. The mastaba did not achieve what it set out to achieve, the eternal sustenance of the dead, but it achieved something else, something its builders never intended. It preserved the record of a civilization so completely, so vividly, so specifically, that modern scholars can reconstruct the daily life of the Old Kingdom with a level of detail that would be impossible without it. The mastaba failed as magic, it succeeded as history, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Purjet, the house for eternity, was not wrong about eternity. It was simply wrong about what would last. Not the car, not the bar, the offerings or the false doors or the sealed serdabs, but the record, the archive, the painted walls that show a cow calling to her calf across a river, and a potter shaping clay on a slow wheel, and a woman baking bread in an outdoor oven, and a man standing on a papyrus boat in the marsh with the sun at his back, and the reeds around him, and the water beneath him, and the whole of the Nile Valley stretching out in painted glory on a tomb wall at Saqqara. That is what lasts. That is what the mastaba preserves. Not the dead, but the living, not the person who was buried, but the world that person lived in. The house for eternity does not house eternity. It houses evidence. And evidence, it turns out, is the closest thing to eternity that we have. Let that sink in. The Purjet was designed as a house for the dead. It works best as a window for the living. The entire funerary program of ancient Egypt, the most elaborate, most expensive, most theologically sophisticated death cult in human history, produced its most lasting value not for the people it was designed to serve, but for the people who came after. The dead gained nothing. The living gained everything. This is perhaps the deepest irony in the history of architecture, and it is an irony that the mastaba bears more fully than any other building type. The pyramids, for all their fame, are architecturally uninformative. Their interiors are largely blank, their surfaces largely undecorated. The temples, while richly inscribed, deal primarily with gods and kings, with the official, propagandistic version of Egyptian life. The mastabas deal with everything: agriculture and architecture, fishing and furniture making, music and metalwork, birth and butchery. The mastaba is the only building type in ancient Egypt that depicts the full breadth of human experience, from the grandest rituals to the most mundane chores, and it does so not because the tomb builders intended to create an encyclopedia. They intended to create a meal, an eternal banquet magically supplied for a single dead person. The encyclopedia was a byproduct, and what an encyclopedia it is. Scholars have identified more than 200 distinct occupational activities depicted in Old Kingdom mastaba reliefs. These include at least 12 types of fishing, 8 types of bread making, 6 types of beer production, 5 types of weaving, 4 types of metalworking, and 3 types of boat construction. Each activity is depicted with sufficient detail to allow modern researchers to understand the techniques involved, to reconstruct the tools, the processes, and the organizational structures of each trade. The mastabas are, collectively, a technical manual for an entire civilization. And the manual is illustrated. No other culture in the ancient world produced anything comparable. The Mesopotamians, who were the Egyptians' closest rivals in terms of administrative sophistication, left vast archives of cuneiform tablets. But those tablets deal primarily with economic transactions, legal disputes, and religious texts. They do not depict daily life in visual form. The Greeks, who arrived on the historical scene more than 2,000 years after the Old Kingdom mastabas were built, produced magnificent art. But Greek art deals primarily with mythology, athletics, and warfare. It does not depict bread making, or beer brewing, or cattle herding with the same systematic comprehensiveness. Only the Egyptian mastabas attempt to depict everything, to create a complete visual record of a functioning society, rendered on the walls of a house for the dead. And that record is, in many ways, more valuable than the archaeological remains of the living city that once stood below. Memphis, the capital of the Old Kingdom, the city that the Saqqara Mastabas overlooked, the administrative and economic center of the Egyptian state for more than a millennium, has largely vanished. The mud brick houses, the wooden palace, the warehouses and workshops and temples, all of it has been destroyed by the annual Nile flood, by the reuse of building materials, by the simple passage of 4,500 years. Memphis is a field, a flat expanse of farmland and scattered ruins, with a few colossal statues lying on the ground, and a small open-air museum marking the site of what was once the greatest city in Africa. But the mastabas survive, and the mastabas contain, in their painted scenes, a portrait of the city that is gone. Its markets, its workshops, its farms, its boats on the river, its officials in their offices, its workers in their fields. The city of Memphis is lost, but its image is preserved. In the Purred Jet, the houses for eternity that stand in the desert above where the city used to be, looking down on the ruins of the world they were designed to outlast. The mastaba outlasted Memphis, the tomb outlasted the city, the house of the dead outlasted the house of the living. If that is not a vindication of the Purred Jet, not as magic but as architecture, then nothing is. Stand at Saqqara on a winter morning, before the tour buses arrive, when the plateau is quiet and the sky is still pale. Look south. The step pyramid of Djoser rises from the desert floor, its 6-stepped tiers visible from kilometers away. The oldest pyramid in Egypt, the oldest monumental stone building on Earth. Its limestone has weathered to a warm honey color. Its recently restored casing catches the early light. Now look around it. On every side, extending to the limits of vision, the plateau is covered with the low, flat, rectangular forms of mastabas. Thousands of them, in every state of preservation, from nearly intact to completely collapsed. Some are marked with archaeological signage. Most are not. They spread across the desert like a fleet of grounded ships, orderly rows of stone, each one a house for eternity, each one containing, or once containing, the body, the name, the offerings, and the painted history of a single person. These are the houses that came before the pyramid, and they are still there, outnumbering the pyramid by a ratio of thousands to 1. For every pyramid ever built in Egypt, there are thousands of mastabas. For every royal tomb, there are thousands of non-royal ones. The mastaba is not the exception, it is the rule. It is the normative form of Egyptian burial, the standard expression of the Egyptian relationship with death, the building type that served 99% of the Egyptian elite for the entire duration of their civilization. And yet, when the world thinks of Egyptian burial, it thinks of pyramids. The 1% has overshadowed the 99%. The royal form has eclipsed the common one. The exceptional has replaced the typical in the popular imagination. And the result is a distorted understanding of Egyptian civilization. An understanding that foregrounds royal power and architectural spectacle while backgrounding the daily life, the social structure, and the artistic achievement of the thousands of officials, priests, and administrators who actually ran the Egyptian state. The mastaba corrects that distortion. It is, by its very nature, a democratic monument, not in the sense that everyone could have one. Mastabas were expensive, and only the elite could afford them, but in the sense that it represents the broad middle range of Egyptian society, the tier between the king and the commoner, the viziers, the governors, the scribes, the priests, the military officers, the royal architects, the overseers of granaries and cattle counts and workshops. These are the people who appear in the mastabas. These are the people whose lives are depicted on the walls. And these are the people without whom the pyramids could never have been built. The pyramids were built by the state, but the state was run by the men in the mastabas. Every block of limestone that was quarried, transported, shaped, and placed in a pyramid was managed by an official whose own tomb was a mastaba. Every team of workers was supervised by a foreman whose ambition was to build his own mastaba after his death. Every administrative decision, the allocation of labor, the procurement of materials, the scheduling of construction, was made by a bureaucrat who expected, when his time came, to be buried in a rectangular stone tomb with painted walls and a false door. The mastaba is the infrastructure of the pyramid age. Without it, without the administrative class it housed, the social system it reflected, the artistic traditions it fostered. The pyramids could not have existed. The pyramid may be the visible symbol of Old Kingdom Egypt, but the mastaba is the invisible foundation, and the foundation, as always, is more important than the symbol. This has implications for how we study the ancient world. We tend to focus on the exceptional, the biggest building, the powerful king, the most dramatic event. We build our understanding of civilizations around their peaks, their monuments, their famous names, and we neglect the everyday, the systems, the routines, the ordinary people who made the peaks possible. The mastaba is a corrective. It redirects attention from the peak to the base, from the pyramid to the plain, from the pharaoh to the people who served him, lived beside him, and outlasted him in the record of their own tombs. And the mastaba has one more lesson to teach, perhaps the most important one. It is a lesson about what survives. Not what we intend to survive, not what we design to survive, but what actually survives, through the blind machinery of time and chance. The mastaba builders intended their bodies to survive. The bodies are gone. They intended their grave goods to survive. The grave goods are gone. They intended their car to be sustained forever. The hacker is silent. They intended the offering formula to be recited in perpetuity. The formula is unspoken. Everything that the mastaba was designed to do, it has failed to do. But the walls survived. The art survived. The information survived. The daily life of a civilization 5,000 years gone survived. Not because anyone intended it to, but because the medium happened to be stone, and the climate happened to be dry, and the tombs happened to be sealed by sand that no one disturbed for millennia. Survival was not planned. It was lucky. It was accidental. It was the byproduct of a system designed for a completely different purpose. And that, in the end, is the mastaba's most humbling lesson. We do not get to choose what survives. We build our houses for eternity. We fill them with everything we value. We seal them with every protection we can devise. And then time decides, impartially, indifferently, without regard for our intentions, what endures and what dissolves. The mastaba builders chose wrong. Their priorities, the body, the gold, the car, were the things most vulnerable to loss. The things that actually survived, the art, the architecture, the documentary record, were the things they valued least. We are making the same mistake. We are investing our civilizational memory in digital formats that are more fragile than mud brick. We are trusting our archives to systems that are more ephemeral than sand. And we are assuming, as the mastaba builders assumed, that our intentions will determine the outcome. They will not. Time will determine the outcome. And time, as the mastabas remind us, has never consulted anyone about its plans. The mastabas do not despair about this. They simply stand. They have stood for 5,000 years. They will stand for 5,000 more, if the desert is left to do its work, and the climate does not shift too dramatically. They ask nothing. They require nothing. They are the most low-maintenance monuments in the history of human architecture. Boxes of stone in a dry desert, needing neither electricity, nor maintenance, nor institutional support to persist. They are, in the most practical sense, a better investment in permanence than any technology we have invented since. And the information they contain, accessible without power, without software, without internet, will remain readable as long as anyone can see paint on stone. The hieroglyphs will remain decipherable as long as the Rosetta Stone is understood. The images will remain intelligible as long as humans can recognize a cow, a boat, a fish, a loaf of bread. The mastaba communicates across 5 millennia, not because it is sophisticated, but because it is simple. Because it uses a medium, colored stone, that does not require interpretation through a machine. Because it presents its information in a form, visual narrative, that is accessible to any human being with eyes. We have spent the last century digitizing the world. We have scanned the mastabas, photographed them, modeled them in 3 dimensions, uploaded them to databases, and all of that work is valuable. But the digital copies are not more permanent than the originals. They are less permanent. The originals are made of stone. The copies are made of data. The originals need nothing to survive. The copies need everything: servers, power, maintenance, format migration, institutional commitment. When the servers go dark, the copies vanish. The originals will still be there. This is not an argument against digital preservation. It is an argument for humility. The mastaba builders, for all their theological convictions, were humble about materials. They chose stone because stone lasts. They chose mineral pigments because mineral pigments last. They chose desert locations because deserts preserve. Every choice was practical. Every choice was grounded in the observable behavior of materials over time. They did not trust magic to preserve the dead. They trusted physics. And physics, unlike magic, delivered. We could learn from this. We could supplement our digital archives with physical ones, with records carved in stone, printed on acid-free paper, engraved in metal, stored in dry environments away from the forces that destroy organic materials. We could hedge our bets the way the mastaba builders hedged theirs, by layering system upon system, medium upon medium, so that if one fails, the others endure. The mastaba builders understood redundancy. They understood backup. They understood that eternity requires not one solution, but many, stacked, layered, overlapping, each compensating for the failures of the others. Their theology was wrong. Their engineering was right. And the mastabas, those flat, unlovely, overlooked rectangles of stone, are the proof. So what were the mastabas? They were the pyramids that came before pyramids. They were the houses for eternity, the purjet, that the ancient Egyptians built for more than 3,000 years, from the very first pharaoh of the first dynasty to the last officials of the late Old Kingdom and beyond. They were mud brick rectangles in the desert, and they were limestone palaces underground. They held bodies and gold and grain and beer and gaming pieces and copper, tools and ivory labels with some of the earliest writing on earth. They held the bones of retainers who may have been sacrificed and the painted portraits of officials who expected to live forever. They were the tombs that evolved, from simple pit burials covered in sand, to mud brick chambers lined with timber, to niched palace facades made of thousands of bricks, to stone-lined rooms decorated with the most detailed and vivid art the ancient world has ever produced. Over 5 centuries, the mastaba transformed, and then, in the hands of one man, Imhotep, it was stacked upon itself and became the first pyramid. The pyramid did not replace the mastaba. It grew out of it. The step pyramid of Djoser is not a new invention. It is a mastaba that kept climbing. And after the pyramid was born, the mastaba lived on, adapted, refined, liberated from the constraint of serving royalty, and free to become the canvas on which the non-royal elite painted the full richness of their world. The decorated mastabas of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the tombs of Ti and Meroruka and Ptahhotep and hundreds of others, are the most comprehensive visual record of daily life. In any ancient civilization, they show us how the Egyptians farmed and fished, how they built boats and brewed beer, how they hunted hippopotami in the marshes and herded cattle across the river, how they danced and played music and competed in wrestling matches, how they organized their workshops and managed their estates and supervised their workers, how they lived. The pyramids do not show us these things. The pyramids are silent interiors, blank walls, empty chambers, geometric perfection without human detail. The pyramids speak of power and theology and cosmic alignment. The mastabas speak of bread and beer and the sound of a cow calling to her calf. And if you want to know what it was like to live in ancient Egypt, not as a pharaoh, but as a person, the mastabas are the only place to look. To answer the title question directly, the mastabas were not failed pyramids, not preliminary drafts, not architectural warm-ups for the main event. They were the original and enduring expression of the Egyptian relationship with death. They were older than the pyramids by 5 centuries. They were more numerous by a factor of thousands. They were more informative by any measure. And they contained, within their flat, rectangular, unassuming walls, the most complete record of ancient life that any civilization has ever produced. The pyramids are the monuments everyone knows. The mastabas are the monuments everyone should know. The pyramids inspire awe. The mastabas inspire understanding. And understanding, real, specific, detailed understanding of how a civilization lived and worked and built and died, is rarer than awe, harder to achieve, and ultimately more valuable. The next time you see an image of the Egyptian desert, the Giza Plateau, the Saqqara necropolis, the long ridge of sand above the Nile, look past the pyramids. Look at the low shapes around them. Look at the flat rectangles that stretch in every direction, half buried, half forgotten, patiently enduring. Those are the mastabas. Those are the houses for eternity. They have been standing for 5,000 years. They held the first pharaohs and the last viziers. They held the oldest writing and the finest art. They held the bones of the sacrificed and the images of the living. They held everything that mattered, and they are still holding it, quietly, in the desert, in the dark, under the flat roofs that gave them their name. The benches, the purjet, the houses for eternity, waiting for someone to enter, waiting for someone to read the walls, waiting for someone to say the offering formula one more time and bring the dead back, not to life, but to memory. The sand shifts, the sun sets, the false door is still there. Walk through it.